It's my real pleasure to introduce Andy Pershing, who relatively recently became our Chief Scientific Officer. He had been part of GMRI as a joint appointment with the University of Maine for 7 years. So he's working here actively, partnering really well with our scientists. And then it was time for us to hire a new Chief Scientific Officer who's really responsible for driving the strategy of our research team and working with the rest of the management team to ensure the health of the organization. And we did a global search. We looked far and wide. We had applicants coming in from Australia and Seattle and all over the place. And ultimately, we chose Andy. Has done an amazing job. He's just been a great addition to GMRI, and I hope you enjoy the lecture.
And thanks everybody for coming. So what I'm going to do today is try to talk a little bit about some of the animals that we see here in the Gulf of Maine. And really, so the theme of the Sea State lecture for this season is animals from away. And so we're trying to think of that from a bunch of different ways. So including invasive species, right? Animals that shouldn't be here but are. And today what I'm going to do is talk about the species that come from away every year. So our migratory species. And then next week is going to be a really interesting lecture that I'm going to touch a little bit on some of the ideas, and that's that some of these species are changing. The Gulf of Maine is changing really quickly. We're seeing some really big changes in a lot of the species, both those that are resident here and those that migrate here. And Janet Nye from Stony Brook University is going to be up next month to talk about some of her research, really looking at climate impacts on the fish community here in the Gulf of Maine. So what I'm going to do is talk from the point of view of three kinds of animals: whales, fish, and birds. I'll talk about 3 different whales. I'm going to talk about bluefin tuna as the coolest fish in the ocean. And then I'm going to talk about puffins as one of our iconic bird species here in the Gulf of Maine. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how some of the changes that we're seeing in the Gulf of Maine are impacting these species. And I will talk about a little bit about this guy, Atlantic cod, at the very, very end, even though they don't migrate. Okay, so if you go out on a boat in the Gulf of Maine, the neatest experience that you're likely to have is if you get to see a whale. And especially if you get to see a whale, like this humpback here or this right whale here, jumping, right, breaching out of the water. These are absolutely extraordinarily huge animals. Blue whales do come into the Gulf of Maine occasionally. They're the largest animal on the planet, but they're not a common visitor. We don't see them really regularly like they do in a couple of places up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. But we actually have a lot of whales that come to the Gulf of Maine. And I'm listing 4 of the baleen whales here that are more common here in the Gulf of Maine. So the fin whale, in reverse order of size, fin whales are actually the second largest whale in the world. So they can weigh up to 57 tons, so just extraordinarily large animals. They do occasionally breach, and there are some pictures online, but it's really rare to see them breach. Most of the time when you see a fin, and a lot of people call them finback whales, you'll just see them roll. So you'll just see them breach, you'll see them you'll see them spout, you'll see them their backs roll over, you'll see their little dorsal fin, and that's it, they're gone. They're incredibly deep divers as well. The second largest that we have in the Gulf of Maine are right whales. These guys here in the middle, on the lower right, they can weigh about 35 tons, roughly the size of a school bus. Okay, another really, really massive animal. Humpback whales, which is this one here on the top left, they're the showmen in the region, right? They're the ones that have these, big, long pectoral fins. They're really famous. They do a lot. They're a lot more active at the surface than many of the other whales. Perhaps a little bit more social. They're also a lot more vocal. So they're ones that, if you go out on a whale watch here in the Gulf of Maine, especially if you go out of Provincetown, these are the whales that you're likely to see. But here in Casco Bay, we do actually get whales. We don't think of Casco Bay as a whale hotspot, but even here in Casco Bay, you can see some of these whales. With minkies, only 5 tons, right? 5 tons, right? We say it's small. But minke whales, only 5 tons. roughly 10, 15 feet long. But we will get them in Casco Bay, and they're actually fairly common here in the Gulf of Maine. Okay, well, why are they here? These whales come to feed. Okay, so here are two humpback whales feeding off of Stellwagen Bank. You can catch a little bit of a glimpse here in the lower left corner of what they're eating. That is a herring jumping out of the water. What's amazing about whales, so we have a lot of animals in the Gulf of Maine, but what's really amazing about whales is that they don't bother feeding on just one fish at a time. They eat them all, right? They will find a school of fish, and they will try to, with their very large mouths, encompass a big portion of the school. They get a ton of fish in their mouths. They then, you can see the baleen plates here on the roof of the mouth of these, of the humpback whales. You can see their throats, the vents that they have in their throats that allow them to expand and hold all the water and fish. Well, they're going to squeeze that out, and the fish will be caught behind the baleen plates, and then they go into the whale's stomach. So the whales are here to feed. What are they feeding on? Well, so we have I'm going to have fins, humpbacks, and right whales, and I'm going to build just a very simple food web that we're going to carry throughout the talk. So, well, humpbacks, like we said, we're eating herring there in that picture. The fin whales will also eat herring. But fin whales are more likely to be feeding on krill, and that's partly why they're such deep divers. Krill will migrate down very deep during the day, and the fin whales have to be able to chase them, and so they can dive to really great depths in order to get the krill. So herring are, a few inches to, maybe a foot or so long, small silvery fish that can be very abundant here in the Gulf of Maine. Krill are half an inch to an inch long, okay, and can also be incredibly abundant in the Gulf of Maine. Right whales, though, you'll see are sort of hanging out here on the right, no pun intended, and they eat copepods. Okay, well, what's a copepod? Well, a copepod is a relative of a krill. Both of these are crustaceans in the same group that that crabs and lobsters are in, except these guys, krill, are pretty good swimmers. Copepods are very good swimmers, but they're really only going to swim up and down. So they're part of the plankton. They get pushed around back and forth by the currents. So they're not really controlling where they are in the Gulf of Maine, but they do move up and down a fair amount. So the copepods that right whales eat are called calanus. They're about the size of a grain of rice, and they're incredibly nutritious. It's a little hard to see in this image, but there's this sort of shiny patch here in the back, sort of right in the center. That's an oil sac. It's actually what the copepod is going to use to survive the winter. They hibernate just like bears. And so just like bears, they have to put on fat so that they can go through their what's called diapause, or a state of reduced activity. And so to do that, they pack on these lipids in this oil sac, which makes them a delicious treat for right whales. And also herring, and also krill. Okay, so now we're beginning to see a little bit of the complexity that we have to deal with here when we're thinking about the food webs in the Gulf of Maine. Okay. Well, what do the whales do when they're not here? Well, when they're not here, they go to the Caribbean because they're mammals, right? They're smart. They're going to go to the Caribbean in the summer because that's the place to be, or in the winter because it's it's not very nice to be here in the winter. It's much nicer to be down here, and that's where they breed. So our humpbacks are going to an area mostly north of the Dominican Republic and off of the Virgin Islands. But there are other discrete groups, what we call stocks of humpback whales, that also go to this same breeding area. In fact, all of the humpbacks in the Western Atlantic go to this one place to breed, including some that are coming from Greenland and Iceland. And so they're going down to this place. The males and the females go together. The females will give birth to a calf. They'll then meet Mr. Right or Mr. Humpback. And then they will migrate back, and they will be pregnant. And so the neat thing about humpbacks is that they can actually have a calf every year. So they have really high reproductive output, especially for such a large animal. The other neat thing is that what determines which kind of humpback you are? Well, what determines which humpback you are is your mom. Okay? If your mom is from the Gulf of Maine, you're going to migrate to the Gulf of Maine. If your mom is from Iceland, you're going to migrate to Iceland. Your dad, though, could be from Canada, right? So they all get mixed up down here on the breeding grounds and on the calving grounds. but then they go their separate ways, and they'll keep going and doing the same migration throughout their lives. Right whales are a little bit less interesting, mostly because there aren't as many of them. There are only about 450 right whales in the Gulf of Maine now, which is 100 more than when I started studying them, so I take a lot of credit for that. There used to be populations of right whales in the eastern Atlantic as well, but right now in the North Atlantic, all of the right whales are here along the east coast of the U.S. They feed, as I said, in the Gulf of Maine, and they calve off of the what we call the South Atlantic Bight off of Florida and Georgia. And then they'll make this migration back and forth. In right whales, only the females migrate, and only the females who are pregnant. So the rest, the males and the females, we think stay pretty close to home. They're a little bit dispersed, but there's actually some really neat work that's going on that says, unlike humpbacks that do their breeding down here in the warm Caribbean, that right whales actually do their breeding in the Gulf of Maine in the winter. Go figure. Okay, not the most romantic place, but anyway, that's what right whales do. All right, so moving on to bluefin tuna. So bluefin tuna are some of the most amazing fish that we have in the ocean, and certainly here in the Gulf of Maine. As you can see, this is Walt Gillette, who's one of our scientists. Walt is a research scientist from the University of Maine who works here with us. Walt is not a very tall guy, but he's not exactly short either, right? This is an amazingly large fish. So the largest bluefin tuna ever caught was 1,500 pounds, right? Just think about that, 1,500 pounds. Just a huge, huge animal. The neat thing about tuna, though, is that as you can catch a little bit of a glimpse of with this, the wave that's sort of, for the wake that's coming in on the dorsal fin there, is that they're incredibly fast. They can swim at 40 miles an hour. So they're sort of like a jet ski, right, in terms of both their size and their speed, although I like them a lot more than I like jet skis. Okay, well, bluefin tuna, why are they here? They're here to eat. And what do they eat? They're eating herring. Of course, they'll eat other things, and the same thing is true for the whales. But if you look at a bluefin tuna's diet, over the course of its life and over the course of a year, most of the energy that it gets is coming from herring, and that's because herring are very nutritious. Just like the copepods that have all of this fat, herring are also very fatty, mostly because they're eating copepods. Okay, well, where do they go when they're not here? Oh, by the way, this is a baby bluefin tuna, which I think is just about the cutest thing in the sea. Okay, so baby bluefin tuna, well, our bluefin tuna make their babies in the Gulf of Mexico. At least most of the fish that we find here in the Northwest Atlantic are going to migrate into the Gulf of Mexico. And actually, the bluefin tuna spawning site, we don't know a lot, surprisingly, about their spawning. But one of the big concerns after the Deepwater Horizon, the BP oil spill, was that it was very close to the spawning area for bluefin tuna. It happened right at the time of year when they spawn. So far, I haven't seen any studies that have suggested that was a real that really impacted that population. But it was certainly a really big worry that summer. But this isn't the only population of bluefin tuna. There are actually bluefin tuna that feed off of South America and migrate into the Gulf of Mexico to breed. There are bluefin tuna that feed off of Europe and migrate back into the Gulf of Mexico to feed. But there are some of those also go to the Mediterranean to breed. They don't go to the Gulf of Mexico, they go into the Med. There's also a group that feeds off of North Africa that goes into the Med. Some of the fish that we see in the Gulf of Mexico, in the Gulf of Maine, will actually go to the Mediterranean. And some of the fish that feed in the Mediterranean and in this area will come here to breed. So much more complicated than what we were dealing with in whales, and much harder to study. We can look at a whale's tail, we can identify individual whales really easily. It's much harder to do that with the tuna, especially because they're swimming across these great distances. Now, all of this movement is interesting biologically, but it's really important for management, for the management of this species to get it right. So as the picture with Walt and his giant tuna showed, this is a species that we fish. It's a very important commercial species. It's highly valuable, especially in Japan and for the sushi market. And it's fished on both sides of the Atlantic. And the fishery is managed through an international process called ICAT, the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna. And all of the countries that have a stake in tuna get together and they have to figure out what the quotas are going to be for the different populations, for the eastern and western population. But in order to do that, they have to have an idea of if a fish is caught here in the Gulf of Maine, how likely is it to be a fish from the western, that spawned in the Gulf of Mexico, or a fish that spawned in the Mediterranean. And that's a really tough problem. The reason it's important to get this right is that if you have two stocks that mix together, if one of them is much more productive than the other, which is what we think is going on in the Mediterranean Sea, the Mediterranean stock is much bigger and much more productive than the Gulf of Mexico stock. It's very easy to have overfishing on the smaller, less productive stock. And so that's the big concern, is that we really have to understand how these stocks mix together in order to be able to set those quotas in the right way. And so we're actually doing some really interesting work here at GMRI and with the University of Maine on this problem. So here's Walt, the guy with the tuna. He is dissecting a tuna head while the Japanese delegation of ICAT that was here last summer for a meeting is watching him do that. They had never seen this done before. And this is what he's pulling out, is this Y-shaped thing, and this is a picture that was taken under a microscope of what's called an otolith. So this is the ear bone in the tuna, and you'll notice the bands here on the otolith. You can see them here, and I'll try to remember to point over here. These are annual bands, and so you can count the bands, and you can actually tell how old the tuna is, which is important for understanding how quickly they grow. But for this stock problem of trying to understand west or east, we're actually really interested in this little part here at the center, okay, over here. That's the part of the ear bone that's laid down when it was a baby, when there's that cute little big-eyed baby tuna, when it was in the Gulf of Mexico or the Mediterranean. So we can drill that out, we can pulverize the bone, we can shoot it through a mass spectrometer, and we can look at the different chemicals, the different isotopes that are inside there, and we can actually tell, because the chemistry of the Gulf of Mexico is different than the Mediterranean Sea, where that fish was born. And so we can begin to take samples in the Western Atlantic, as well as we're working with people in Spain to get samples from the Eastern Atlantic to try to understand how many of these fish are moving back and forth across that essentially arbitrary international boundary. We're also doing some work on the modeling side. Lisa Kerr, who's one of our scientists here, is doing some work to really try to understand how could you go about assessing a population for bluefin tuna to take into account that mixing so that you could come up with quotas that are really smart and effective. Okay, now moving on to puffins, right? So in Maine, we love puffins, right? You come out of the airport, one of the first things you see in the Portland Jetport when you go in is you see puffins there and lobsters, right? You can buy yourself a stuffed puffin. There are very few colonies in Maine. It's a really special treat when you get to see a puffin here in Maine. It's not so much of a special treat if you live in Newfoundland or Iceland, where they're incredibly common and actually hunted for food. You can go to restaurants in Iceland and get puffin because they're so abundant. So I've always thought it was a little bit ironic. I kind of imagined an Icelander coming into the airport here and seeing us selling puffins. It would be sort of like how we would react if New Jersey put lobsters on their license plate. Because there are lobsters in New Jersey, there just aren't a lot of them. Okay. So puffins are here, of course, to feed, and oh my gosh, they're eating herring, okay? But they're eating not so much the big guys that the bluefin tuna are going after. They're eating the much smaller ones, the juvenile herring, especially here in the coastal waters of Maine. And where do puffins go when they're not here in the Gulf of Maine? They go north and east. Weird, right? Why would you do that? I actually don't know. My guess is that probably they're doing a lot of feeding. Right? Something like a whale can put on a lot of blubber, and so they can actually sustain these migrations. Something like a tuna also can carry a lot of weight with it. It can go a little bit without feeding, but they do a very good job feeding on some of the fish that are really abundant at depth when they're migrating down here. But puffins are small, right? It's much harder for them to do. They're also not particularly great flyers compared to something like a like a seagull or a tern. And so they're very oceanic. And as far as we know, and I don't think we know a lot about this, they spend a lot of their winter at sea in the North Atlantic. Okay, so now we can ask this question. Why are they here? Why are they here? Why are puffins, tuna, and whales here? Somebody want to answer? Take a guess? Herring, right? Food, herring, right? Yeah, herring, the number one. Of course, krill are important to the fin whales and copepods are important to right whales. But if you had to pick one reason why we get all of these migratory species in the Gulf of Maine, it would be herring. Most of our migrators love herring. Humpbacks, fins, sei whales, minke whales are all coming to eat herring. Dolphins and porpoises, we have a few species of those in the Gulf of Maine, are all here to eat herring. Terns, razorbills, gannets, some of our other birds are here to eat herring. I saw seagulls the other day on Commercial Street eating herring that fell out of the back of a truck. We also have some of our other fish, right? Striped bass are migrating here, bluefish. Many of our other fish are coming here to eat herring. Okay, so if you had to pick one species, and in fact there's a food web that's out there that the Northeast Fisheries Science Center put together, and it's really neat to kind of look at the diagram. It's much more complicated than the one I put together. But what you see is that so much of the energy in the Gulf of Maine is channeled through herring. Okay? But there's an asterisk. Also alewife, right? River herring, sand lance, which are another small silvery fish, and essentially all small silvery fish. Okay, so why do we have so many herring? Copepods, right, copepods. Yes, I love copepods. All right, yeah, so we have a lot of Calanus, and in fact, Calanus is abundant all throughout the North Atlantic. It's sort of the archetypal species of the North Atlantic. In fact, it's one of the most abundant multicellular organisms on the planet. But we have some of the highest concentrations of Calanus anywhere in the world here in the Gulf of Maine. We have tons of them. All right, so why do we have tons of copepods? Lots of phytoplankton. Who was that? Is that Evan? Oh, there you go. All right. Yes, lots of phytoplankton, right? So phytoplankton are single-celled algae. So these guys, diatoms here, have these beautiful glass frustrals. They're about the size of the head of a pin. There's some that are even smaller. There's some that are so small they were only really discovered about 20 years ago using some really special techniques that had to be developed. So the image I'm showing here is an image from NASA's SeaWiv satellite, which is a satellite that looks down from space, and it can look at the color of light coming out of the ocean. And it can tell from the intensity of that light and how green it is, how much chlorophyll is in the water, and then we can estimate the amount of chlorophyll and the amount of phytoplankton biomass that's in the ocean. And what we see is that in these green areas, we have, next up text, but in these green areas we have this very characteristic food web, very much like the food web we have in the Gulf of Maine. Some of the species change, the amounts change, but in these green areas, especially in the green areas along the coast, you have food webs that look a lot like the Gulf of Maine. You have big diatoms, big by phytoplankton standards. You have big copepods, Calanus, which is big by copepod standards. You have krill, you have herring, and then you have all of these amazing predators that migrate in to feed on those species. In these blue areas, much lower standing stock of phytoplankton, lower productivity. You have smaller phytoplankton cells, really, really teeny tiny little guys, so small that the copepods can't eat them. In order for a copepod here to eat them, they have to be eaten by these small ciliates called microzooplankton, little single-celled kind of paramecium type things, then copepods, and then some small fish. And it just takes a really long time to build up that biomass in those areas. Okay, so why do we have so much phytoplankton in the Gulf of Maine? I should have warned you that this was going to go deep, but we're almost done. All right, we're almost done, and this is the hard part, so bear with me. So why do we have so much phytoplankton in the Gulf of Maine? Well, here's a what I'm modeling here is a column of water. Okay, and this is this green area is the phytoplankton. So you can see in summer, which I'm depicting by this picture that I took out of my office window. In summer, we actually don't have a lot of phytoplankton in the Gulf of Maine. Okay? We see it here on the coast, but if you go, especially offshore, the water actually gets quite clear in the summer. The reason it's clear is, well, first of all, the reason the phytoplankton are near the surface is because they need light. They're essentially a plant. They have to do photosynthesis, so they're up near the surface. You're not going to find phytoplankton down where it's dark. But the other problem that we have is that the nutrients in the summer that the phytoplankton need are also down deep. And the reason that they're down, and the other problem is that we have this thing that I'm depicting as a yellow line that we call the picnic line. It's a contrast in density. So we have warm, light water that's sitting on top of cold, dense water. And just like oil and vinegar and salad dressing, it's hard to mix those. The density difference makes it hard to mix these mix water across the picnic line. And so the nutrients are essentially locked away from the phytoplankton. And so phytoplankton abundance is really low in the summer. Okay, so now we're going to turn the weather crummy, just like, unfortunately, we're headed into the fall and winter. And as we begin to cool the surface waters, the density contrast gets smaller. And as we begin to blow some wind over the water, mix them up with some storms, we're going to erase that nutrient barrier. And then the nutrients can now mix. And now we're going to homogenize the water. And so the nutrients that were down here now get spread evenly throughout the water. Okay? But the phytoplankton, the darn pinky phytoplankton, are still not happy. Okay? They're not happy here in the winter because, well, we have less light, right? Our days are shorter, the sun is lower in the sky, so we're not getting as much light. But the other problem that we have is that just like the nutrients are being mixed around, the phytoplankton are being mixed around as well. And when the phytoplankton get mixed down in the dark, they can't do photosynthesis, and so they don't grow. And so they're spending a portion of their day down deep, and so you don't get a lot of production. Now, as we move into summer, we're going to, and in particular in the spring, we're going to start to add some heat to the surface of the ocean. Let the winds die down. We have fewer storms, and we reform this density contrast, right? This picnic line. And so now what happens is that that's going to keep the phytoplankton up near the surface. Whoops. I guess I didn't transition in a minute. So we're going to keep that phytoplankton up near the surface, okay, up where it's light. The days get longer, we have more intense light, and we actually get a bloom of phytoplankton that isn't coming through on this computer. This is supposed to be like really huge and really big and sort of scary world being taken over by phytoplankton, which is what happens in the spring. We get a very explosive spring bloom here in the Gulf of Maine. So a huge production of phytoplankton in the spring, and then that fuels our food web. So then you get copepods a month later, and you get lots of new herring and other small fish after that. So the total productivity in an ecosystem is ultimately controlled by the supply of nutrients. So if you look, all of these places where it's green have really strong, intense seasonal cycles. So the Gulf of Maine, we have really strong mixing. Here in the North Atlantic, we have really strong mixing, right? Cold winters, warm summers. There are also other places, and so that mixing brings nutrients to the surface on a seasonal basis. We also have places like the coast of California. You can see kind of a narrow green haze, around California there. That's coastal upwelling. So essentially the winds over California are trying to push the water offshore. And as that water goes offshore, you have cold, nutrient-rich water that comes up from below. When that gets exposed to the surface, the phytoplankton bloom. And so you get a bloom of phytoplankton in these upwelling areas. Similar thing is going on the equator. And then you can look at then some special areas. It's a little hard to see, but there's a yellow dot here in the Gulf of Maine, right there. That's Georges Bank. Georges Bank always has chlorophyll. And in fact, we, in many places in the Gulf of Maine, do all the time along the coast. And these are places where we get really intense tides, because we have really big tides in the Gulf of Maine. And does anybody know what happened today with the tide? King tide, right? It was our highest high tide of the year. Yeah, it was pretty remarkable. We have really big tides in the Gulf of Maine, and those tides stir up the water and bring the nutrients to the surface in some of these places. Okay, so why are they here? Well, we like to think of people coming to the Gulf of Maine, coming to the coast of Maine in the summer, right? We're a tourist state, right? We like it when people come and visit in the summer. But that's not why the animals come here. I mean, they come here in the summer, yes, but the reason they're here is actually because we have really crummy winters and really big tides. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about some of the changes that we've seen in the Gulf of Maine from the point of view of a couple of these predators. So this is the temperature time series in the Gulf of Maine going back to 1982. This is also measured by satellites. We have records that go back quite a bit further, but I like this one because it's a really nice, clean record that we can use to look at temperature patterns in the Gulf of Maine. So this black line is the long-term average warming rate in the Gulf of Maine, about 0.03 degrees Celsius per year, fairly gradual, very close to the global average. This is global warming, right? This is the rate of warming that we get in the Gulf of Maine because of global warming. But over the last 10 years, we've had a really amazing warming pattern in the Gulf of Maine. We've warmed at 0.23 degrees Celsius per year, almost a degree Fahrenheit every year over those last 10 years. And in fact, this year, right now, looks like we're going to be about right there. We're going to be very close to the temperatures that we had in 2013, even though we had this very cold winter. We've actually had offshore some very warm conditions that have persisted this year. So we've had this amazing warming trend. I'm sorry, I wanted to point out the 2012 ocean heat wave, right? Our peak temperatures occurred in 2012 as part of this ocean heat wave that went from Cape Hatteras to Iceland. But this warming trend is really remarkable. There are very few ocean ecosystems that have experienced warming like we've had over the last 10 years. So this is a map that my colleague Nick Record at Bigelow and I put together. The colors here are showing essentially the slope of that line. So the yellow areas and the red areas are areas that have warmed, and the red areas are areas that have warmed really intensely. Blue areas are areas that over the last 10 years have cooled. So you see this kind of cooling pattern. This is called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. It leads to cooling over here in the Pacific and warming over here. But if you look at all of these areas and you just add up the area of ocean that's warming faster than the Gulf of Maine, it's really, really small. We've, over this 10-year period, we've warmed faster than 99% of the global ocean. And in fact, if you look at the longer-term records going back to 1900, we've warmed faster than 99% of ocean areas have ever experienced. So it's a really, really remarkable temperature trend that we've seen. And the one thing I want to point out is that I'm not projecting that this is going to keep on going. I don't think we think that can do that. More than likely, this is part of a natural cycle that's sort of superimposed on this black line, this already warmer Gulf of Maine, and that we will kind of go to some cooler periods. But we can learn a lot about how ocean ecosystems respond to warming by studying the Gulf of Maine over these last few years. So, a couple of the impacts of the warming. So, herring, like we said, are an important food for baby puffins. Okay, so this is a puffin chick happily munching on a baby herring, okay, a juvenile herring. But in 2012, the herring were, we think, further offshore and probably deeper in the water because the water was so warm. And the puffins, and instead, the fish, the small silvery fish that was abundant off of the breeding colonies here in Maine were butterfish, these guys, which are not as delicious as they sound, at least if you're a baby puffin. And the problem is that the shape of the fish is wrong. So the puffin chicks can't actually swallow the butterfish. So the parents, who evolved to hunt anything that's small and silvery and swimming in the ocean, were bringing them back, right? Okay, I got a good meal for you, right? Giving them to their babies, and the babies couldn't eat them, and so the babies starved. So they had a really, what they call a colony collapse in 2012, and also a really bad year in 2013. I just heard at a meeting the other day that 2014, some of the more normal conditions we had last winter, that the butterfish weren't inshore, the herring seemed to be back, and the baby puffins have done quite a bit better this year. The last thing I want to talk about is cod. Now, cod are not a migratory species, but migratory species are part of this story. Okay, so you have to bear with me. So cod are obviously a really important species, an iconic species here in the Gulf of Maine, right? We named the whole cape after them, for crying out loud. The target biomass, the biomass at maximum sustainable yield, the biomass that we expect there to be at sort of the peak production of the fishery is 69,000 metric tons. Okay, it's a lot of fish. The current biomass, according to the most recent stock assessment, is just under 3,000 metric tons. So about 3% of what we think there should be. Okay, so it's been a really remarkable decline. This is a species, a stock that's been overfished sort of chronically for the last 20 or 30 years, but the last few years it's really fallen off a cliff. And this is what's ironic is that this has happened at a time when we think we've gotten really good at managing cod, and when we think we've done a really good job at limiting the fishing effort and making sure that the fishermen are staying within their quotas and keeping them in their quotas. So, despite all of that, the 2014 landings, this is what's allowed for this year, is 1,500 metric tons. The 2015 landings that have been that are being considered by the Fisheries Management Council right now, this is the quota for next year. And by law, they're supposed to pick a quota that allows them to rebuild the stock in 10 years. So by 2025, it's essentially zero. They cannot rebuild to 69,000 metric tons by 2025 from the current population. Within 10 years. Rebuilding is possible, it's just going to take longer. And so this is really, really challenging right now for the management system to deal with how the heck are they going to rebuild this stock, but also for the fishermen who are now dealing with a species that was a really important commercial species for them, and now it's one where when the little bit of cod quota that they're going to get next year, as soon as they hit that quota, they're going to be done for the year, and it's going to really constrain their ability to go after haddock and pollock and some of the other more abundant species. Okay, so how does this connect to temperature? Well, the blue line here, so the red line is the temperature time series, the same one I showed in the other graph. And so you see the peak warming in 2012. You see, 2013 is a little bit cooler. The blue line is the fishing mortality rate on cod. Now, this is a complicated thing. This is essentially how many fish are caught divided by how many fish there are in the ocean. Now, how can fishing mortality be correlated with temperature? Especially at a time when we have very fixed quotas, right? Where we're counting the fish, let's see, in 2010, and we're putting a quota that should put the fishing mortality down here. How do we end up with a fishing mortality that's higher than ever? Well, the way you do that, we're controlling the number of fish that are caught, but there were fewer fish than we thought, and so you end up with higher fishing mortality than the management was trying to allow for. And so you end up with higher fishing mortality during those warm years. And what that means is that there were fewer fish than we expected in those warm years. Okay? And the other interesting thing is that in 2013, a little bit cooler than 2012, the fishing mortality rate comes back down a little bit. Okay? And so that means that our expectations are a little bit closer to reality. So they're not quite dying as fast as we thought in 2013. So why are they dying? Well, we think it's actually mortality. We think that over this period, over this warming period, we've seen increased mortality of cod. Okay, that essentially they're being killed in other ways than fishing over that time period. We're looking at a variety of species to try to uncover, what could be driving this mortality. But I want to point out this time series for spiny dogfish. So spiny dogfish are a shark, small shark, about that long, that can be very abundant here in the Gulf of Maine. They are a migratory species, thank goodness. I was able to work them in somehow. Okay, so we have spiny dogfish that migrate into the Gulf of Maine in the spring and summer to feed on a variety of things. These things will eat anything that swims in front of them. But there is some evidence that suggests that they like to eat a lot of cod, especially here in the Gulf of Maine. Now, this increase, this blue line, right, that sort of goes up very much in line with our temperature, this is not that there are more dogfish in the ocean. What I think we're seeing is the fact that there are more so this survey is happening during the spring, at a very fixed time of the year. What we're seeing is that the dogfish in these warm years, we think have just migrated in sooner, and so that we see more of them than we do in a cold year. So what the model that we're putting together, that we're trying to put together to try to link cod and temperature and these predators together, is that you think about a seasonal cycle of predation, right, for our cod. We expect that they probably have higher mortality in the summer when there are a lot of predators around, when the predators are more active, and also when the cod themselves are more active, when they have to go out and find food themselves. Anytime they're swimming around, that's going to put them at risk of being eaten. Well, in a warmer year, you're going to expand that window of predation. And in 2012, right, that peak year that we saw, it was it doesn't really matter what temperature you pick. That temperature occurred 20 days earlier in 2012, and actually occurred 20 days later at the end of the year. So you add more than a month of extra high predation in 2012 than you would normally have. Okay, so just some quick conclusions. So whales, birds, big fish, they come here to eat, right? And their favorite foods are things like herring and copepods and krill. The buffet is on because we have really, really terrible winters. Not because we have glorious summers or even beautiful falls. It's really because of the winter. Because that's what's going to bring the nutrients up to the surface. All small silvery fish are not created equal, especially if you're a baby puffin. We've also done some research that shows that some changes in the size of herring are actually really important for bluefin tuna for determining how fat the tuna are. And then the last thing I want to say is that the warming that we're seeing in the Gulf of Maine is changing the relationship between our predators and prey, sort of decoupling the system a little bit. And we know that this warming is going to continue. We also know that we're going to have cold and warm along the way as we move into our warmer future. But we do know, and we can learn from years like 2012, what our ecosystem is going to look like in our warmer future. So, thank you very much.